David Carter was the kind of man who believed he had seen it all. A successful businessman in his early 40s. David had built his fortune from scratch after his father's death left the family in financial ruin. Now the CEO of a prominent tech company, he lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, where wealth often isolated him from the world outside. He trusted no one easily, having been betrayed more times than he cared to count. His house staffs were professionals paid to do their jobs and keep out of his personal affairs. Among them was Mia, a quiet and polite young maid in her 20s, who had worked in his home for the past year. She was efficient, uncomplaining, and always seemed to vanish into the background. David barely noticed her most days, except for the fresh flowers she left on the hallway table and the occasional warm cup of coffee she prepared for him when he returned home late. But something about Mia nagged at him. It wasn't suspicion in the conventional sense. She was too meek, too unassuming to be hiding anything malicious. Yet her eyes carried a depth of sorrow that no amount of polite smiles could conceal. David, in his solitude, began to wonder about her. Who was she, beyond the uniform and the polite greetings? What kind of life did she return to after she left his mansion gates at dusk? Curiosity gnawed at him, and one chilly evening in November, when Mia clocked out and quietly slipped out the back entrance, David made a snap decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He grabbed his coat, slipped into his car, followed her. Mia's journey took her through the city's maze of narrow streets and dimly lit alleys. Far from the affluent neighborhoods David was accustomed to, the well-paved roads gave way. 2 cracked sidewalks and run-down apartment complexes. David kept a discreet distance, careful not to be seen. He felt foolish, like some character out of a cheap drama. But something about Mia's solitary figure moving through the dark streets kept him from turning back. After nearly half an hour of weaving through the city's underbelly, Mia arrived at a modest, crumbling building with peeling paint and flickering hallway lights. David parked at a safe distance and watched as she entered. A few minutes later, unable to contain his curiosity, he approached the building and peered through a gap in the curtain of a ground-floor window. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Inside the sparsely furnished room, Mia knelt beside a small bed where a frail, elderly woman lay, her face pale and worn by sickness. A child no older than 6 sat quietly at her side, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. Mia's expression, so guarded and reserved in David's home, was transformed by tenderness and grief. She spoke softly to the woman, adjusting her blankets and brushing her hair back. The boy looked up at Mia with wide, trusting eyes as she handed him a piece of bread. David felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent his life assuming the people who worked for him were faceless employees, cogs in a wheel meant to serve and vanish. But here was Mia carrying the weight of a world he hadn't even imagined. He stepped back into the shadows, his heart heavy with shame. David returned to his mansion that night, the once comforting silence now oppressive and suffocating. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The image of Mia's weary face as she cared for the sick woman haunted him. How had he, a man who prided himself on his perceptiveness, failed to see the humanity in those around him? Over the next few days, David watched Mia closely, not with suspicion, but with a newfound awareness. He noticed the exhaustion in her posture, the way she winced when moving her shoulder, likely from carrying heavy groceries or tending to her loved ones. He saw how she lingered near the flower beds, perhaps seeking a small moment of peace amidst the chaos of her life. A part of him ached to confront her, to apologize for his blindness, but he feared invading her privacy even further. Instead, he discreetly asked his driver, an old friend named Carl, to inquire about Mia's circumstances. What David learned broke his heart. Mia had lost both her parents in a car accident years ago and was left to care for her grandmother, who had recently suffered a stroke, and her late sister's orphaned son. With no formal education, Mia worked multiple jobs to cover medical expenses and rent. She refused charity, determined to stand on her own feet, enduring each day's hardship with quiet resilience. David realized how far removed he had become from the struggles of ordinary people. In chasing wealth and status, he had forgotten compassion to asterisk. One evening, as Mia was about to leave, David called her into his study. She entered hesitantly, her hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of her apron. David gestured for her to sit, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, with a heavy sigh, David confessed that he had followed her. Mia's face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock and fear. She stammered, apologizing profusely, assuming she was about to be dismissed. David quickly reassured her that she had done nothing wrong. He told her what he had seen the sick grandmother. The little boy admitted how ashamed he was for never acknowledging her struggles. Tears welled in Mia's eyes, and for the first time, the carefully constructed walls between employer and employee crumbled. David offered to cover her grandmother's medical expenses and arrange for proper care, allowing Mia to rest and focus on building a better future. At first, Mia refused, her pride wounded, but David insisted not as a favor but as a debt he owed to himself for his years of indifference. He even promised to set up a scholarship fund for the boy when he came of age. In that small, dimly lit study, two souls, worlds apart in status but united in grief and resilience, found solace in one another's presence. Mia's tears fell freely, not of despair, but of relief, a burden lightened by unexpected kindness. Asterisk. From that day forward, the mansion no longer felt like a hollow palace. David invited Mia's family to live in a nearby cottage on his estate, ensuring they had access to proper health care and education. The boy, named Leo, quickly grew fond of David, often accompanying him to the gardens where they tended the flowers Mia once nurtured alone. The bond that formed between David and Mia's family was built not on obligation, but on mutual respect and quiet gratitude. David, for the first time in years, felt a sense of belonging that no amount of wealth could purchase. He began to volunteer at shelters and funded programs for single mothers and orphan children, his heart forever changed by the quiet strength of a young maid he had once overlooked. Mia, no longer burdened by constant worry, pursued evening classes, her dream of becoming a nurse now within reach. And though their relationship remained professional, an unspoken connection lingered between them, a shared understanding of loss, endurance, and redemption. The mansion, once cold and lifeless, bloomed with warmth and laughter. David learned that sometimes the smallest acts of curiosity could lead to the most profound transformations. And in a world often divided by status and wealth, it was the simplest human connections that carried the greatest power to heal.